First, thank you everybody for showing up here today. So the case in front of us is the Keystone Pipeline. The ultimate question that we have is, did President Obama act appropriately with regard to him halting the development on the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2014? So our ultimate stance is that, yes, he did act appropriately. The reason being is that it should have been somewhere else and with a different company that was more responsible. The Dakota Access Pipeline was initially conceived as an idea to bring oil from the tar sands down in Canada and some of the oil reserves in North Dakota down to the mainland of the U.S. Essentially, in order to do this, they initially had a route constructed that went north of Bismarck, North Dakota, and then down farther into the Midwest. But then after that point, they decided, you know what, actually, we're going to move the route to the point that is just north of Standing Rock Lakota Reservation. So just for the frame of exact distance, because it's actually going to be important later in the round, is that it was exactly 0.55 miles, just barely north of the Standing Rock Reservation, that went just under the Missouri River. There were other pipelines north of Bismarck and generally in the area, but this is by far the largest and the most significant so far. Also, another thing that's going to be important is previously in 1853, the government had established a treaty with the Lakota, essentially saying that we will protect the rights to your land, and we will give you the right to hunt and fish and things like that. And that we will, in exchange for this, we will have like some sort of supreme authority. So in exchange for the government having some sort of supreme authority, they were required to uphold their end of the bargain of essentially making sure the land was usable for hunting and fishing and for living on, just for general, we have supreme authority and you can live in peace. So that was the general arrangement. Over time, the reservation was just chipped down ever so steadily to the point that the initial size of the reservation is now just almost completely gone, and now they're just little small pockets throughout North and South Dakota. So this is actually where we need to start our case. So the first reason why we say that President Obama did, in fact, act appropriately is, first and foremost, of the impacts of the pipeline on hunting and fishing rights of the tribe, and with regard to our contract, we think, with our contract that we made with the Lakota, this is really important. So it's important to establish like what the pipeline actually does. So when they build the pipeline, like just north of the Lakota land, just the construction of the pipeline disrupts the ecology in the area to the point that it can potentially damage the ability of animals to live there, things like that. The reason it does so is not only just disturbing the earth, but also there's the potential of an oil spill. So when we build these pipelines, just because it's North Dakota, it gets really cold in the winters and a little bit hotter in the summers, things just expand and contract and things of that nature. And that increases the probability of a spill, especially with regards to like a pipe breaking or something like that. So because of that, you have this issue that if a pipeline were to burst, which is in fact fairly likely, and we know it is to be likely, if the pipeline were to burst, then because it goes right under the Missouri River, and the Missouri River generally flows south, you raise the toxicity levels in the Standing Rock Reservation, essentially making it near to impossible to actually have consistent ecological life there to the point that you can actually hunt and fish and live on that land healthfully and normally, which we think is actually incredibly important. Because if we were to build this pipeline, what we'd essentially be saying is that our contract with the Lakota Sioux, is just worthless. Like, we don't actually care about our initial commitment to the Lakota Sioux, which we find is deeply problematic because in our ethical framework, we believe that people ought to be bound by their contracts to other people. We believe that that is how the government attains its legitimacy. If the government were to just decide that its contracts just did not matter anymore, there's no real reason to say that any particular social contract actually has any validity. So then we go down to the second point of historical marginalization of Lakota Sioux. So, as I established earlier in the case brief, because the Lakota Sioux have just had their land chipped away and chipped away and chipped away, the construction of this pipeline was kind of the buck stops here moment. It wasn't like previously they weren't being oppressed and things like that. It was more that this was the final straw. And we think this is actually incredibly important because this was the point at which it actually did infringe upon. Thank you, Dr. Parsons. This was the point which it did infringe upon the actual ability of them to hunt and fish, live on that land. And also we can see that just the way that the investigation was carried out as to what the impacts of the pipeline would be was also actually very intentionally marginalizing. So actually, in the top of my case brief, you might remember that I said that the reservation was 0.55 miles away from the Dakota Access Pipeline. So what was really interesting is when the Army Corps of Engineers and other engineer groups investigated the pipeline to try and determine the impacts of construction and the impacts, actually just the impacts of construction, they drew a radius, essentially an affected radius around the pipeline, but they drew the radius at exactly 0.5 miles, especially right by Standing Rock Reservation. So I'm sure you can all probably see the connection at this point. They intentionally drew the line right outside of that range that they would have to include the Standing Rock Reservation within their analysis. We see this as deeply problematic, first off, because it's just common sense that rivers in North America generally run towards lower elevation, and seeing as the Missouri River runs south, it would stand to reason that you need to include more area to the south. So it's just seems to me that it would either take an incredible idiot or someone who just intentionally wants to marginalize people to actually draw that line exactly where they did. So with regard to the analysis, like the ecological analysis, they just intentionally excluded the Dakota people. So not only have we historically in the past marginalized them, it's more that building this pipeline was a continuation of doing that, and in fact legitimizing the actions we've done in the past to the point that we're going to say that we ought to continue marginalizing these people into the future, which we find deeply problematic, especially considering the fact that they are American citizens. So finally, we get to this last point, that they probably should have done it with a different, more responsible corporation. So this comes down to the actual corporation that they used, and this was the Trans-Canada Corporation. So the Trans-Canada Corporation initially, as the name suggests, started mostly in Canada and trying to bridge oil down to the U.S., but it's interesting really looking at their record. So like actually, how good are they at doing their job? Because theoretically, an oil company would try to not spill oil because that's just losing your profits. Like for instance, if I were running a pencil company and just lost half the pencils one day, I'm pretty sure my boss would be pretty upset. If I just walked up and said, "Hey, I just lost half of our product," he'd probably say, "What on earth are you doing? You're fired." So the same thing is here. So if we have an oil company that's just consistently losing oil, then we should probably say, we should find a more responsible company. But actually, this is what we have been finding. So it's even in their own corporate social responsibility brief. So in their brief, they established that they lost 214 million gallons in 2014 just due to random oil spills. And even up into 2015-16, they've been oscillating in between 2 and 1 spills a year. Seeing as we know that this sort of terrain is fairly likely to produce an oil spill, and we also know that this particular corporation has a very strong history of oil spills, then if we actually had to pick any particular company to do so, it probably shouldn't be TransCanada, because they're just fundamentally irresponsible. So ultimately, that's why we believe that President Obama did act appropriately. There are a few objections to our case, though, that we'd like to bring up. So one of the biggest objections is that corporations have the economic freedom to act as they will. So we'd like to give some pushback on this because we believe that corporations only have the economic freedom to act insofar as the government that they're acting within actually has established those sort of rules. For instance, if China has decided that no American company will operate within their borders, an American company deciding to break said treaty and just operate within China's borders anyways would be outside of their bounds of economic freedom. In much the same way, because the United States of America has established a sort of treaty with these people not to infringe on their ability to hunt and fish and live on this particular land, a company saying that we have the economic freedom to do this would just be fallacious, because they'd be infringing upon upon the government's formally established contract. Another big objection that comes up is, like, what are the impacts to North Dakotans? So for this, all I'd really have to say is a few things. Is that we're not particularly against the construction of a pipeline in general, just not this particular pipeline in this place with this particular company. A pipeline that would open up oil to North Dakotans, we think, would probably be a good thing, just not there. And thank you very much. That was...
Nice job.
Thank you.
There's 1 minute for the other team.
I think that, like, the problem with their case is that they, like, the most ethically flawed thing... Ooh, do we have time to ask some questions?
I don't think so.
We can pose
I think we just have
questions,
to.
but
We can propose
have to
questions
open it.
within our statement.
Okay.
But it's just a statement.
So, do y'all know if the pipeline actually goes through the land from the 1853 treaty, or is it only like 5 miles away from it?
It was 0.5 miles
It's
away.
0.55 miles.
But it doesn't go through the actual land.
No, but it puts
No,
it at
technically.
risk.
It puts it at risk.
That's the idea. It's down the river, and
If something were to go
likelihood
wrong, the effects
of
of
a
it would
spill.
definitely affect.
Okay.
One of the issues, though, they said, they proposed at the very conclusion, right? They said, well, we want to talk about the impact of the Dakotans and the people that are actually affected by it, right? And they started talking about but they left out the idea that it's been such a surplus for their economy, and it's actually been very well for
I
the
don't think we
Dakotans.
should take that
I don't think we
ethical
should either.
stance. I think that their problem is that they, like, how they frame it is they say, like, when they're talking about the impacts on the rights of the Sioux, they talk about, oh, we feel bad for them because it disrupts their ecology and it harms the legitimacy of the government. Those are, like, that's just furthering this, like, dialogue that the U.S. government has on the Native groups, that they don't have actual rights. We only worry about them when, one, we think the environment is in danger, and two, our legitimacy is in danger. Those aren't the issues of the problem. The ethical, like, issue of it is that we made a treaty with them in 1853, and we haven't held true to this, and this, and, like,
Right.
it's not like we should focus on the marginalization aspect.
Well, I'd like to thank the other team for presenting this case. We think that they took a very interesting stand. And we also would say that President Obama did take the appropriate decision when he halted the development of the Keystone Pipeline in 2015. But we would like to propose that the main reason why this was the appropriate decision was more focused on the ethical implications upon the social contract that the government had with the Sioux people rather than the other impacts that the opposing team prioritized in their case. So first, I'd like to talk about this idea of, like, marginalization as well as the rights of the group that the other team first presented. And we think that these 2 points are good points, but they could have been framed in a much better way to actually advocate the ethical implications that this case would have on this on the Sioux. So basically how they frame it with saying that the problem with this pipeline is that it's just bad because it's a pipeline and it would cause damage to the ecology and the environment, and this contract is so important to the legitimacy of the government. We think that framing this infringement upon the rights of the group in this way, in the fact that we only care about your rights as a group if we think that the environment could be damaged or we think that the legitimacy of the United States government could be threatened, we think that this framework is furthermore detrimental to this relationship that the Sioux group has had with the government. So we want to go back and talk about this 1853 treaty and kind of emphasize the history of this and the weight that this has had upon the current situation. So in 1853, this treaty was made between the Sioux and the government, and they did give them the rights to land, and ever since that's happened, the government has furthermore infringed on these rights and taken land for their economic goals. And then in 1980, the Supreme Court took the side of the Sioux and said that we will not let this infringement upon the rights of the Sioux persist, and we will not let this happen again. And so this decision was really important because it set the tone that the government was going to reject this infringement upon the rights of the people and their livelihoods. So this isn't an issue of the legitimacy of the government, nor that we're worried about the environmental damage to the land. It's simply that the Sioux have the right to the land based on this treaty, and we've been infringing on it for years, and they have told us that it's time that they've had it, and this is the stopping point, even though that they are not in opposition to any economic development, but we think that this is the most important thing. And this is because of this social contract and the ethical responsibility that the government has to the Sioux group rather than these issues that are concerned with just their legitimacy and the fact that the pipeline further marginalizes them. We think that this is the most important factor that comes into it because it contributes to this idea of structural violence. So structural violence is the idea that the government or any social institutions can indirectly cause harm to groups based on these social structures. And this is just an example of the structural violence that can happen to the livelihoods of the Sioux if this continues. And that's the most important issue that we should focus on rather than legitimacy or the specific ways that this group is developing their pipeline, because we think that any further development in relation to the land, even if it's 0.5, even if it's 20 miles, if it's going to affect their land, it should be halted. And so we would say that this is the most important stance that we can take because it holds the most true to the government's social contract with its people. And as the other team said, the Sioux are citizens of the United States of America, so we should take that into consideration. And even if the judges buy their arguments on the environment, we think that their argument would furthermore be supported by the specific use of tar sandbags, which we feel aren't proper because scientists have predicted that these would cause irreparable damage to the environment if they are put in place. So this just shows irresponsibility of the corporation as a whole, not just that it has spills. All pipelines can have spills and all oil companies can have spills, but these specific developments that they're creating should be addressed specifically. And for these reasons, we think that the other team does not adequately frame the case because it ignores these bigger impacts that the government has.
Thank you. Okay, judges, you have 1 minute.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting extension of the case. So we're going to go ahead and give you some responses. I think more of our responses are more clarification on the case rather than direct responses to what you just said. So your first point, you come out and say like the marginalization of the Sioux and the tribes in that area should be the main focus of why why President Obama's actions were the appropriate action at the time. We agree with you, and I think that this is held inside of our case. The point of the further applications of our case were that even if you didn't buy that the marginalization of the Sioux is the reason, like stop the message there that we should stop the pipeline, which we fully believe it is. We believe that the marginalization of the Sioux and the ethical implications involved in that are the most relevant argument to this case that we're examining right now. But even if you don't buy those, the truth of the matter is that like because of the economic and ecological damages that would ensue and the damages to the legitimacy of the United States as an institution, those are further reasons that even if you didn't buy those ethical implications at first, that you should still side with that President Obama was taking the appropriate action and stopping the Keystone Pipeline.
I think another major point that you brought up and something we'd like to address is this idea that any further development in relation to this land should be halted. And we were pretty clear in our case that we do not think that there should be any further development in this location for multiple reasons, not only the harms to the people, but the historic marginalization and what you referenced as structural violence to the Lakota Sioux people. However, we do think that separate from this location, there should be an American pipeline. A pipeline that gives us access to our own gasoline would be fundamental to continuing the capitalism of the U.S. economy, and it would reduce our dependence on foreign oil while making us more cohesive as a unit. And so, although we agree that it should not be in this location, we definitely do support the construction of a pipeline in a different location with a different corporation in charge. And I'll allow Jess to elaborate a bit on this methodology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a critical point that you guys brought up was that the land that we had given in the contract should not be further impacted. I think our team wanted to caution on the use of further impact in terms of limits. It sounded as though the further impact of the land could be expanded to an ominous and infinite degree. Our team would argue that the pipeline ought to be instated, ought to be installed, but that there should be prudent risk and a fair, judicious evaluation, which I think Nate talked about when he talked about the specific company being used. Our team wanted to advocate for a company that is taking intelligent, prudent risks and has a good track record, as well as picking a different location in order to not necessarily, 100% eliminate all the potential risks of doing a pipeline, but to take a judicious, prudent approach to doing so.
Okay. I guess that leaves it to me to kind of end this one out. So one thing about your case that I thought was really interesting is towards the end you say that we don't care if it's 20 miles away or whatever, as long as it impacts the Sioux people, that is ultimately what matters. And on this we would generally agree with you. Like we'd say like that's basically the case. That's also why I added in the issue of the fact that just being barely outside that range. Because the distance, the exact distance by which we draw the radius, matters less than what the pipeline actually affects. Like on that, we generally agree with you. So we just admit that was probably just a little bit of a misconstruation on your part, which is fine. But the reason why we'd still support like the construction of a pipeline in general is because we believe like there is the possibility for it not to impact the Sioux. For instance, you could build it as far away as above Bismarck, North Dakota, or places like that. But also there's another compelling reason to build the pipeline, and that is if oil doesn't go by pipeline, we have to establish like where then does it go. So currently the most predominant modes of transport are truck and barge. And if you send it by truck, that's just an incredibly dangerous accident waiting to happen. That also has resulted in a lot of just deadly accidents and spills. And then also by barge would just be dumping directly into the river, which would be just definitely worse. So if we're actually going to compare modes of transportation, we'd prefer a pipeline and just one that's run by a better corporation that has the ability to make it so it doesn't leak quite as much. So ultimately, those are the reasons why we still kind of stand by our case and still accept our frame. And thank you very much for offering your criticisms.